Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the BGVP NS9. And as its name suggests, as the title of this video suggests, this is a 9-driver IEM. Now, I put this in the description, right? We around here, we know better than to judge an earphone just by its driver count, but 9 drivers for, it's 170 bucks, so not cheap, but 9 drivers, that could be kind of exciting. But maybe what's even more exciting just than the pure count of drivers is the actual configuration. So of those 9 drivers, 7 of them are balanced armatures and 2 of them are dynamic drivers, which is pretty interesting. When we first unboxed this thing and measured its frequency response earlier on Super Review, we saw that from its frequency response, this is pretty clearly aimed at bass heads. And so I've been listening to it for the past couple of weeks with that in mind. Listening to the BGVP NS9 as a bass heads IEM and trying to figure out how does it stack up against some other bassy IEMs, and especially at 170 bucks, you know, not cheap, but also not like stupid expensive. How does it stack up? So that's what we're going to talk about today. In this video, we'll talk about the build quality, how it fits, what it's like to live with, and then I'll dig into the sound quality with some comparisons against a couple of other IEMs that are kind of in the same price range, including the FIA Audio Legacy 4, as well as the FIO FH3. So, like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. If you're watching now live, I see you all in the chat right now. If you have any questions about the NS9 that I don't answer, please leave it in the chat. If you're interested in checking out that frequency response that I alluded to, it is available on squig.link. That's the URL, that's Squig link. And I guess we'll just dive into the review and talk about the BGVP NS9, which is a lot of letters, as BGVP's products seem to always have a lot of letters, but there you go. We'll just start by talking about what's inside the box, which you see laid out here. A fairly modest selection, but not a bad offering. We do have a little carrying case here, which has got kind of a semi-hard shell and a little package or a little compartment in there for storing things. It's got a zipper and it's fabric covered. I don't know, that's a pretty nice case, honestly. It's a good size to actually be usable. I didn't use it myself, but that's just because I've got my own selection of cases. You also get quite the selection of ear tips over here, including actually 3 different sets of silicone tips, although one of them, the set that comes on the earbud, they only give you a size medium. This is what comes on its stock, but then they also provide a set of what they call bass ear tips and vocal ear tips, along with 2 memory foam ear tips. And we'll talk about what those do to the sound when we talk about the sound. But the other thing, speaking of what they do to the sound, to talk about is these. So kind of like some other BGVP IEMs that I've tried out before, these come with these, and I'm dropping them all over the place because these things are so light, they're actually like static electricity clings them to this box. But the NS9 actually comes with these filters that you can screw on and off of the tip of the IEM to ostensibly change the sound. So they've got a set of red filters, gray filters, and silver filters. And again, when we talk about the sound, we'll talk about what those do to the sound. But for now, for the review, I'll just show I've got the stock kind of like gunmetal colored tips on here. And you can see how they screw off. You just screw them off like that. It exposes your 3 openings down there, and then you can screw the nozzle or the filter of your choice back onto it, and it's a pretty easy mechanism. If I can do this here from a distance, this is, all right, there we go. Not a good demonstration that this is easy, but I swear, it's actually pretty easy. So that's kind of the accessory package that you get here with the NS9. Let's talk about the set itself. All right, so first of all, the cable that comes with the NS9, I gotta say is honestly a really pretty nice cable, and that's not too surprising because I do find that BGVP tends to come with, I don't know, they've just got some of like the best mid-tier cables in the business, honestly. You know, maybe not quite as nice as something like a Dunu cable, but those are, you know, hundreds of dollars. For a cable that comes with a $170 set. This is, in my opinion, one of the best, honestly. I think it's pretty nice looking. It's got a decent level of thickness, and you can see that behavior-wise, like it lies flat. It's not memory prone. It'll stay straight. And then down here you have a pretty typical 3.5 millimeter termination. Nothing fancy, but for me, again, single-ended boy, I'm okay with that. Let's see, up here at the Y-split, pretty typical, actually small Y-split, which is nice. And then you do have a chin cinch, which is borderline functional. It slides around a little bit too much, but if you're into chin cinches, it is functional enough, I suppose. But if you don't like a chin cinch like this, it is a pretty lightweight plastic, so you could cut it off. In fact, I might do that later. I don't know, it's fine. And then up near the top, of course, we've got our preformed ear hooks, and I believe these are MMCX connectors. Let's torque it, there we go, forced it, proved it, it's an MMCX cable. So pretty typical BGVP stuff. So pretty solid on the cable. And then we'll get to the earpieces themselves, which I gotta be honest, are also pretty dang solid. You might be thinking to yourself, that looks a lot like a FiO IM, and you wouldn't be wrong. I think these things look quite a bit like the FH3 and the FH5, which we'll be pulling up on stage in a little bit, but it's generally a pretty handsome look. So you've got all metal shells, right? Clinking them together to make that metal sound. And it's front and back, and just generally, I don't know, I find them pretty nice. I think they're attractive, and they do come in a couple of different colors. But even more importantly than them being attractive, I actually find that they fit pretty phenomenal. The FiO FH3 has got a very similar build to these, like I mentioned, but I actually think these fit better. Just, I mean, at least in my ears. So here is what the NS9 looks like inside my ear. It's not necessarily a very long nozzle, so isolation is pretty solid, but I don't know, not exceptional, but the security is actually really good. And I found that comfort is also pretty dang good on these things. So that is the build quality of the NS9. I guess it's gonna lead us into talking about the sound. And I will start by talking about the filters real quick, because I mentioned that I measured the frequency response of the NS9 and put it up on SquigLink. If you want to check it out, again, that URL is squig.link. You can check out actually what this thing, how this thing measures with the stock screw-on nozzles, and then as well with the red and the silver screw-on nozzles, or the filters. And what you may be surprised to see is that it measures exactly the same. Basically makes it literally no difference which of these filters you use, which is interesting. I don't know why they bother including those. I guess maybe if you wanted to customize the look of your nozzle, you can do that with the screw-on things, but otherwise that is one of the biggest gimmicks, or one of the most obvious gimmicks I've seen in the audio game, so not that useful. The tips, though, interestingly, are actually pretty useful in terms of affecting the frequency response. The stock tips here gave me one frequency response, and then when I threw on the bass ear tips, I was kind of surprised. The bass didn't actually increase, but the vocal range, or kind of like the vocal top level, yeah, kind of like the presence vocal range, lower treble range, that increased. So then I threw on the vocal ear tips, and the fact that the vocal tips have on it is basically exactly the same as the bass ear tips. It's just that the stock tips that come on here are the ones that are actually kind of the outliers. That, I don't know. I find, like, you know, FiO a lot of the times will include a lot of tips, including like a vocal set and a bass set, and then a balance set. I haven't actually spent time measuring those. Maybe I should spend some more time checking them out, but it honestly seems to me like it's mostly a bit of a gimmick, although again, in the case with this particular tip, it does change it. And this is honestly how I spent most of my time listening to this set. So what does the BGVP NS9 sound like? And as the title of this video suggests, this is a very bassy earphone. And you'll definitely see that in the frequency response. So a lot of bass, it's both kind of mid-bass and sub-bass. I think that the bass rise starts pretty early in the frequency response. So it's not isolated into the sub-bass. It does get a little bit on the boomy and bloated side. And then the mid-range, especially in the upper mid-range, is just like super, super recessed. So because of that, vocals get really pushed back into the background. You get that big bass, vocals really pushed out. And then the treble is actually kind of interesting. The treble is not so bad. And it's actually kind of interesting that they have surprisingly well extended treble, which is not a thing I can say of a lot of sub $200 IMs, is that the NS9 has actually got some decent air to it. Probably the last IM I reviewed under 200 bucks that had similar amounts of treble air would have been like the Tin Hi-Fi P1. If you've heard that, you can have that as a reference. If you haven't heard that, I guess use your imagination. But basically treble air just, it gives you, I don't know, like this sense of tiz, or like just this kind of sense of like sparkliness that's not quite as harsh as mid treble and lower treble can be. So that much can kind of be a little bit satisfying, but I don't know, that's kind of the general sound signature of the NS9. A lot of bass, mid-range really pushed back like to a surprising amount, but then an interesting, I think a surprising amount of treble air that kind of cuts through the bass a little bit and prevents it from just sounding entirely underwater. So what do I like about the sound signature here on the BGVP NS9? It would be that treble extension. Honestly, I think, you know, it's probably not the best quality treble I've heard of all time, but it is a sub $200 set, and I guess my favorite treble I think is currently probably in like the $3,000 set. So yeah, I guess I didn't say too much by saying this isn't my favorite. It's pretty decent treble, I think, and that treble extension is frankly pretty satisfying. Like, it gives it an interesting, just kind of sense of depth and stage, I suppose. It's not necessarily the biggest staging earphone, but we'll talk about the staging in a little bit. It's actually a little bit weird, but I do think that that treble extension on here is frankly pretty nice. And it does, like I suggested, it cuts through that otherwise very, very warm tuning to just give it a decent amount of dimension. Now, that is going to end the part where I talk about what I like about this earphone, because otherwise, I'd be honest, I don't like the way that the BGVP NS9 sounds. And you know, I guess you know that I'm not necessarily a big bass head, so maybe that's not too surprising to you, but I did try to listen to this with the bass head in mind. And there are some bass head IMs that maybe not my favorite, but I can get behind. Something like the Sennheiser IE300, not my favorite tune, but frankly, I don't know, it's pretty fun sometimes. The NS9, however, I don't really enjoy this very much. The bass on here is just not that great. It's kind of bloated. I mean, it's definitely bloated into the mid-range. You can see where it extends into the frequency response, or extends into the mid-range on the frequency response. It's way too much bass in the wrong places. And then the bass that's there, it's just not the best quality. Like, it's not especially tight, it's not especially punchy. It's there. There's lots of quantity of bass if that's what you're after. But if you're after good quality bass, I do think that there are better options. And then apart from there just being a lot of bass, I think that technically, I don't know, the NS9, it can be okay with that treble extension does add a bit of a technical character to the sound, but otherwise I do find it frankly pretty lo-fi. The mid-range is pretty low in resolution. The lower treble, not especially great. And then again, the bass is just not that great a bass, in my opinion. Yeah, detail is just generally not very standout in this against the bass quantities. You do get pretty decent stage and separation, like I mentioned, but like I mentioned, it's pretty weird. And by weird, I mean, I think a lot of this comes from the frequency response that you get here, but the vocals in my music are just like really pushed out into the background. And the bass is pretty big, but I guess because it's not so like tight and punchy, it doesn't really come into the foreground as much. But what does come into the foreground is that elevated treble. And so I get this really weird sense where my vocals are like distant, but still like in the middle of my head. And then the treble is like far away, but also still like right next to my ears, with this really very strong left-right stereo separation that kind of feels exaggerated. I described it, or I wrote down the word disintegrated. You know, there's a word that people use a lot in audio, coherency. And I think most of the time when people are using that word, they're kind of describing, you know, how well the dynamic drivers and balanced armatures and maybe E-stats and stuff, how well the different drivers meld together. I want to call this earphone a little bit incoherent, but less so in the way that the drivers cohere together, and more so just the way that it completely just disintegrates the sound and puts it in just weird places. Like the way, this is another analogy that came to mind when I was listening to it earlier today, right before this video, is, I don't know if you've ever had like an at-home 5.1 surround system. If you ever like sat too close to the rear speaker and it just like oddly stood out and it was like, that's louder than it should be. That's kind of how the extended treble it sounds to me here on the BGVP NS9. Is it just sounds like it's out of place. It just sounds really quite strange. Again, just a really exaggerated stereo sound. So let's bring in some other IMs and talk about how this thing compares to some other stuff. I mentioned here the The Audio Legacy 4. This is an IM I reviewed recently. I gave it 3 stars. Honestly, I was listening to it again. There's a pretty good argument you can give this thing 4 stars, but this is a pretty solid set. Compared to the BGVP NS9, I would say that the Legacy 4 is more of a traditional tuning. It's maybe a light V-shape, slightly bright, with, you know, I don't know, just a pretty well-balanced signature in general. I think that even though this is not a Bassheads IM, I do think that the bass quality here on the Legacy 4 is quite a bit better than the bass quality on the NS9. Vocals obviously are going to be much stronger here on the Legacy if that's what you're after. I think clarity in general, much stronger on the Legacy 4. And yeah, I don't know. There's not really any reason why I would pick the NS9 over the Legacy 4, although if you really just want bass quantities, yes, you do get more bass here on the NS9. And then I will bring in another IM for comparison. This is the FiO FH3, and here's where you can kind of see the resemblance in the build quality. Pretty similar, although I was actually surprised that the NS9 actually fits me better than the FiO. But anyway, apart from the way that they look and fit, sound-wise, again, I much prefer the FiO FH5 or the FH3. The general tuning on here is just closer to neutral with bass boost. This is just a really nice kind of flat mid-range with a nice amount of treble emphasis to it, whereas this, you know, it does have it beat on treble extension if that's what you're after. But I think that the general tonal balance is just much more solid here on the FH3. I think because of that, also the separation and layering comes across really strong here on the FH3, and it doesn't come at the expense of it sounding weird and out of place like it does here on the NS9. And then we get to that bass quality, right? This is ostensibly a review for bass heads. Again, the NS9 does have more bass. If you want more bass, there you go. But I think the bass quality here on the FH3 is so much better. I mean, it's more isolated to the sub-bass frequencies, so there is a chance your music might not actually play with the sub-bass here, but I think the bass here is just, this is actually, in my opinion, really good quality bass. Some of my favorite bass in an IM, if I'm perfectly honest. And then this is just some kind of meh bass. So I think that's gonna do it for my review of the BGVP NS9. Out of 5 stars, you're probably not going to be surprised by this one. I'm just going to give it 2 stars. It's a really nice build quality. I love the way this thing fits, and I guess it does do some things uniquely in its sound signature if this is what you're after. If you're just after a lot of bass, or maybe you're curious about treble extension, like this does those things, but it just comes across in a very weird way that I'm not a big fan of. but maybe you will be. If you're interested in checking out the BGVP NS9, of course, I got a link in the description down below. And shout out to Hi-Fi Go for providing this for review. While you're down there, if you found this video helpful or useful, please hit the like button. Helps me out and helps other people find the channel. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell. 1, because I'm supposed to say that, but 2, because I go live. And if you ding the bell, YouTube will let you know next time I'm live. And then we can have a chat like I'm about to have with the folks that are here right now. But if you're not here right now, I guess I'll catch you on the next super reveal. All right, live stream, live chat. Let me catch up real quick. Whew. All right. Transient Snail, what's up? Ohm State, how's it going? Ohm State, you're saying your EST seems to have finally broken in. Yours? You wrote an EST in all caps. Are you asking about the EST112? Not sure how to answer your question, I suppose. Elfazio, hola, how's it going? Josh Saba, ooh, bass. Hey, bass is not bad. I am not opposed to bass, despite the rumors. You know, I'm definitely not a bass head. But a good bass on an IM can be pretty satisfying, and that's one of the reasons I really like the FH3 is 130 bucks for this quality bass. I think that's pretty awesome. 170 bucks for this quantity of bass. If you're just measuring like your dollar to bass ratio, this is pretty high. But if you're measuring like quality to dollar ratio, I think the FH3 clearly wins that one. Southwest Kitty, how's it going? In Ohm State, I believe, you asked about the tuning filters being sold separately. I mean, I don't know if they also sell them separately, but I can say that the tuning filters came in the box here with the NS9. Don Trumpion, Big Boss, y'alls, what's up? David K saying, what a catchy name. Yeah, BGVP, I feel like they've kind of worked themselves into a bit of a box with their own brand name. Well, I guess they could just start giving them names. If it was like the BGVP Falcon or something like that, that could sound kind of cool. But their brand name is BGVP, and if they follow the not too uncommon trend of naming their IMs letters and numbers, that's just gonna make for a lot of letters and numbers in their naming. The last BGVP I reviewed was the DM8, BGVP DM8. Also a lot of letters and numbers. That set though is actually pretty good. This set, not a big fan. Ohm State, you're asking about the cable specs. I have no idea. It's a cable. Jeremy Kuros, you're calling it the Bravo Golf Victor Papa November Sierra 9. There you go. Is that like the military versions of those letters? And Ohm State, you asked actually an interesting question. How about the sound with no filter? So to that point, I actually tested that. And the way that I tested that, so somebody on the Discord server, I believe Fire, suggested actually punching out the mesh filter from one of these filters and listening to it that way. So I actually did that. This is a filterless filter. The other ones you can see here. Let me pull it into view. The other ones will have sort of this shower head metal grill. I punched it out of the silver ones. And I measured that as well. And maybe surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, it measured exactly the same. Like no matter what is in that filter, it seems to have zero change on the frequency response. Ohm State, you're asking, do I have a way of testing resistance in the cables? I honestly don't know. I'm actually kind of interested. So I do not understand electricity, electronics, or I've burned myself, or I've almost made fires in my house trying to play with electricity. So I don't understand it very well. I do have a multimeter If someone wants to tell me how I can use a multimeter to measure resistance on a cable, that would be a really good conversation for the Discord chat, but I don't know. I don't think I'd have a method. I think I need more than a multimeter for doing that, but I don't know. Das Ninja Sticks, how's it going? Nice to see you. I know you don't watch UFC, but did you see those UFC fights? Oh, is the static coming back again? Debug it real quick live. Why does it do that? Is that better? At what point did the static start happening? Am I gonna have to redo this review? Cut my hair, my hippie. You hippie, yeah. The hair is probably the problem. Precog Vision, yeah, you heard the BGVP NS9. I hope you loved it as much as I did. Big Boss, you're smelling 2 stars? You smelled right. Refract saying, as someone with a Legacy 4 with a good EQ, they sound better than my Blessing 2 Dusk. Well, glad you're satisfied with it. I think I would definitely pick the Blessing 2, however. Although I don't play much with EQ. Brett, I saw you saying something about the Tin Hi-Fi P2s. I haven't actually heard the P2s, so I don't know what they sound like. Juan, you are trying to make the argument that bass is placebo. Interesting. Crafty Fidgets asking, what kind of shampoo do I use? Why, are you impressed? I feel like I would be embarrassed if I said what kind of shampoo I use, so I'm not gonna say. But if you join the Discord server and ask me, I'll tell you there. Fixion with an interesting, yeah, you asked about Apple Music offering lossless at no additional charge. Yeah, that's kind of the big news that got announced early this morning, is that Apple Music, they just announced that all of their streaming is going to be available in literal lossless quality. It sounds like in June, which is pretty exciting. And some of their music is going to be available in 24-bit high res. And I'm guessing that's just some of it because that's, I don't know, if you look for high res music online, you'll find that not all music is even sold in high res. Like, it's just not mastered and exported in that format. I feel like that's honestly pretty exciting news. I know Spotify earlier this year announced that they were going to be doing lossless later this year. And so I guess kind of interesting that Apple beat them to the punch. And then actually right after Apple announced it, I believe Amazon announced that, so they've had lossless quality on Amazon's music streaming service for a while now, but it's been like a paid tier extra. Right after Apple announced it, Amazon announced that it was no longer an extra tier up. It was just all of Amazon streaming music would be available on lossless, which I think is pretty cool. I mean, I have gone on record in the past talking about how I'm not confident I can hear the difference between a high quality MP3 or MP4 in Apple's case, or however they store M4A. So I don't know that it's actually going to make a difference in terms of what you hear, but it does kind of give me a little bit of extra confidence in listening to those platforms if I'm able to listen to lossless stuff. That is interesting. I don't know. I haven't really thought about whether or not this changes my solution, because my solution to music is digital audio players like this with FLAC, lossless FLAC libraries ripped to it. I mean, I would definitely miss out if I'm switched to iPhone and listening to lossless Apple Music. I would definitely miss out having buttons, but it would be a lot easier, much less of a pain in the butt. Sorry about the statics, folks. Jeremy saying that Apple and Amazon are giving MQA the shaft. Yeah, that's the other thing that I'm pretty interested in seeing how it plays out. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, well, let's see, how far back do we want to go in this? Tidal, right? The streaming service has been kind of known for having the closest thing to lossless quality for a long time. They've got some high quality, I don't use their service, so I'll probably get some of these details wrong, but Tidal has for a long time had sort of a high tier, high quality streaming service, and maybe there's even a lossless tier, I'm not sure. But on top of just traditional lossless, they've also kind of they've partnered with this company that does MQA, Master Quality Assurance, or Master Quality, I forget what the A stands for, but basically it was like this different format for streaming music over the internet with a bunch of promises about how it's actually better than a typical lossless file, somehow. But they haven't really been super forthcoming with how it works, and there's been kind of a lot of doubt in the audio community that it's actually doing anything, that it's actually worth the one, going out of your way to get MQA files, which are not super common. You can kind of only get them through Tidal. Maybe there's other places to get them, but the other thing that's kind of a pain in the butt is that in order for hardware to be able to decode MQA audio, they have to pay a license to MQA. So it's this kind of like, I mean, it's not unheard of. I think, you know, Dolby is maybe kind of a video version of that, where if you want to be able to decode Dolby, you've probably got to pay a license to Dolby, and MQA is, I think, kind of the audio version of that. But there was an interesting video a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago at this point, published by Golden Sound, I believe is the name of the YouTube channel. And he just did a really interesting breakdown where he actually went through the trouble of publishing his own music through Tidal with going through MQA encoding, and then on the other end of it, so he knew what he put into the music, uploaded it through the publishing process, and then on the other end of it was able to listen to his music through Tidal and did some pretty interesting analysis on it to kind of figure out what is MQA doing. And the basic gist of what he ended up landing on was the MQA is not actually making the music sound better. If anything, it's making it sound worse, which was not too surprising to a lot of people, but I don't know. I'm curious to see what Tidal does with that, right? Is that a big enough story within the audiophile community that it comes to the point that it actually impacts how well Tidal can market with MQA, especially now that Apple Music, Spotify, and Amazon are all available in like literal just lossless or 24-bit streaming. Like, it seems like there's less and less reason for MQA. Like the main argument for MQA, as far as what I can tell, all right, an MP3 file. Let's say your average MP3 file is about 8 megabytes. Your average 16-bit FLAC file, lossless file, might be 15 megabytes, right? So it might be twice as big. And then from there, if you wanted to go to a 24-bit FLAC file, let's see, how big would it be? Like, it could be a couple hundred megs, right? So going from MP3 to 16-bit, not that much of a size difference. I mean, it's about double the size, but pretty small file sizes. Going from 16-bit to 24-bit, for some reason, increases the file size massively. And so because of that, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to stream 24-bit files. I think I've got a couple of 24-bit albums that are each well over 2 gigabytes, which is kind of insane for a music album. So the promise with MQA was that you could get 24-bit sound quality out of a file that was closer to a 16-bit file. But that need to shrink a file from, let's say, 150 megs to 15 megs, the more that bandwidth and internet speeds increases, the less that need exists. Maybe, I don't know how long ago MQA was first introduced. Let's say it was 10 years ago, right? It made a lot of sense. Nobody wants to download and stream a 150 megabyte music file. But now, 10 years later, and I'm making up numbers, I'm not a historian of this stuff, but let's say now, 10 years later, if you really wanted to listen to high res, it's not unheard of to stream a 150 megabyte file. If you're watching a YouTube video, it might be similar size, similar file size for a similar length. So that's not too extreme. And, you know, as fast forward 10 years into the future, a 150 megabyte 24-bit file streaming that just might not matter at all. So I feel like the need for something like MQA is going to become less. I feel like MQA lost a lot of trust with the audio community just because they weren't very transparent with what it did. And as far as what the audio community can figure out what it's doing, it seems like a bit of a scam. So not having a lot of trust and not really having a good argument, and then Apple, Spotify, and Amazon all just saying, I mean, we're just going to give you lossless anyway. I'm interested to see what that means for MQA and the future of it. I wouldn't, if I was invested in MQA, I would probably disinvest at this point. And that is not financial advice. I do not know what I'm talking about, but it seems bad. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. Ryan Black asking, do I think the tech is there for true wireless IMs to sound as good as the best wired IMs, and we just need a company to invest in such a product? I mean, I think you're right that the Galaxy Buds and the AirPods Pro both sound pretty good. The Galaxy Buds especially, the Galaxy Buds are the one Bluetooth device that I listen to that I'm never really conscious that I'm listening to a Bluetooth device. It just sounds, I mean, it's not necessarily my favorite sound signature, but it's pretty good, and it doesn't sound like it's lacking in resolution or anything like that. The Galaxy Buds Plus, I'm pretty. They give me hope, I guess I should say, for Bluetooth. Now, whether or not Bluetooth true wireless IMs are gonna sound as good as a wired set, I mean, obviously it really depends on what you're comparing it to. So I was just talking about this with a friend. One of the biggest challenges in this question is that there are just so many more non-wireless IMs out there. So there's more wired IMs being manufactured by more audiophile-centric companies that even if like 90% of them are garbage, you're gonna end up with more of them that are pretty outstanding. Whereas in the true wireless space, there's definitely a lot of true wireless, but in terms of like top tier companies doing it or audio companies doing it, there's only a few, there's only a handful, and they do it okay. But there's only a handful of them, and in sort of the more budget market, they're just kind of all using the same hardware with kind of consumer-y tunes. So basically what I'm saying is, if Chi-Fi ever gets serious about Bluetooth and starts pumping out the volume of just different iterations and trying to make true wireless IMs sound as good as wired IMs, they might get there. But I think just purely on the volume and the number of attempts that wired IMs have, there's just a huge advantage there. And then the other challenge is going to be, so there's obviously the Bluetooth limitation in that you can only transmit so much audio over Bluetooth, right? You can't transmit a lossless file via Bluetooth yet. You'll probably be able to get there pretty soon though. I don't think that that is the #1 bottleneck though. I mean, my hypothesis, and this is coming from someone who's never built a Bluetooth IM, full disclosure, but I think the biggest bottleneck at this point is more likely going to come down to the amplifiers and the DACs and the drivers, that they're all trying to fit into a small amount of space. So, right, if I'm listening to, my Walkman, I've got an amplifier and a DAC in here. They're probably not especially large. In fact, the Apple dongle is a pretty good example of how small you can get a very nice sounding DAC with a moderately powerful amplifier. But then there's additional challenges once you put something like that into an ear, right? So you've got to make sure that that your DAC and your amplifier are probably more power efficient than they have to be if they're built into a DAP that has access to, a 1000 plus milliamp hour battery. When they're in your ears, they've only got access to maybe 100 milliamp hours, and so they got to be pretty efficient. So there's that problem. I think then there's also the problem of, just acoustic design when you're taking up space with not just a DAC and the amp, but a battery, and I'm gonna say other miscellaneous electronics. There's just a lot that goes in there. And then you're also fitting in usually a single dynamic driver. And there's just not a lot. It takes up room, and it limits the acoustic designs that the manufacturers have. Now, the one thing that might be the kicker in this, the thing that might change this equation is DSP, or digital signal processing, basically equalization. Because when I'm listening to a wired IM on this, obviously I can EQ if I want, but if I just plug in an IM here, it's just going to be outputting audio, and I'm going to get the raw signal into my ears. However, the driver configuration and the acoustic design of that IM was made. With a true wireless IM, it's not always just down to acoustic design. There are electronics in there that are processing the sound and making sure that what comes out of the driver is the sound that the designer wanted to. And there are going to be some advantages in terms of making an IM sound exactly the way that they want when they've got access to, a controlled amplifier and DAC, right, being inside your ear. It's the same for everybody, plus the digital signal processing that they can program for that DAC amp with that transducer, that speaker, to really, just give the audio designer full control. In some ways, I'm kind of surprised that hasn't already overtaken a wired sound, but it hasn't. And it might still be a few years before that happens, but it could also just be like a matter of, Moondrop getting really serious about TWS. Maybe that'll happen. Another long answer. Grant Patala asking, have I tried out Mr. Walkman's firmwares on my Sony A45? I have, actually. The primary reason I downloaded the firmware, though, wasn't actually... I know he talks about improving the sound, and that's just a really hard thing for me to compare, because I'll listen to the player and then update the firmware to the Mr. Walkman custom firmware, and that takes, let's say, a minimum of 20 minutes. In between then, my ear memory is maybe not, I don't think, strong enough to confidently pick out sound differences. There are certain things that sound maybe a little bit different, but without being able to go back and forth, A/Bing it really quickly, I'm not confident that I can say that I like the sound of it better. What I do like about it, though, is that it introduces the graphic visualizer, so you can see the lines bounce up and down, and I like that. He hate me saying UFC was epic. You're right. What's my D4D value champ right now? My D4D. What a D4D value champ right now. What does D for D mean? Did you mean P for P? Because I know what P for P means. Is D for D, is that like are you making a joke? Or is that just a term I don't know? I mean, if we're talking about D's, shout out to Dan Maragliata's. That looked painful. Oh, and Grant, you've got the Mr. Walkman firmware on your ZX300. Cool. Were there any new features that it introduced with the ZX300, or was it just about the sound? And Juan with his own take on the TWS thing, and this is probably similar to what I said. Issues with TWS is that in order to have the features that people demand in a TWS enclosure, the acoustic chamber needs to be absurdly small. You have Samsung and Apple doing a good job at making these really compact chambers, but for the massive dynamic drivers or BA arrays with accompanying crossovers, you really need more space. Yeah, I'd be interested to see if maybe there's an alternative design to TWS that you could, you know, maybe have ear hooks or something like that, and then leave the electronics for the ear hooks and then leave the earpiece just for the acoustics. That might be an interesting solution. And there is on that note, I should be doing a review soon of the FiO TUTWS3. I probably got those letters and numbers in the incorrect order, but that's kind of what I just described. So that might be the better direction for now. Quick Swip saying you can't show up on time for every bass review, but I'll try the next one and ask again. What did I miss a question from you, bud? And DOS Ninja Sticks, thanks for answering. So MQA, I said master quality, and I forgot what the A stood for. DOS Ninja Sticks, authenticated, you're right. Which kind of suggests like some sort of DRM sort of thing, and it's, I guess, not too far from the case, but I think they're trying to suggest that somehow locally they're able to authenticate that the song you're listening to is exactly the master that was listened to in the production studio or something. I don't know. It's a bit of hokum. And yeah, on the topic of TWS, Jeremy, that's an interesting point. You say the main reason that you're not willing to spend much money on TWS is that there's kind of a built-in expiration date. You know, rechargeable lithium-ion batteries, you recharge them, I don't know, 1,000 times. Well, I don't know what the typical life is, but let's say 1,000 times. After that, they stop holding their charge, and then just kind of gradually gets worse over time. That's true of all electronics. So it's definitely true of true wireless IMs, and it's interesting because it's like we expect that of a phone. We're kind of okay with that with the phone, even though a phone probably costs more than your true wireless. But with audio stuff, we don't expect that because none of my other headphones are gonna ever, I mean, they might die if I break them, but they're not gonna die from being used too much. And that is a problem with true wireless. I'll just read this one. I don't think this is a question, but some interesting commentary from Fixion saying, it is ironic that Apple are doing this now though, talking about the lossless streaming, saying they removed the headphone jacks from everything and they're pushing true wireless headphones. Most of their customers won't realize their Bluetooth earphones aren't actually able to deal with lossless. It's great for us wired audiophiles though. And I think that's a pretty interesting point, is that yeah, there's no headphone jack on an iPhone, and yes, you can get the dongle, and the dongle is actually pretty good, but it doesn't even come with the iPhone anymore. So this whole push towards lossless audio is like not even a thing that's really going to benefit their target customers, unless their target customers are going to go out of their way, like we might, and, you know, connect a dongle or connect an external DAC to your phone. Because yeah, if you're listening over Bluetooth, your Bluetooth is not going to stream lossless audio. Even if you're listening to Apple Music and you're listening on your AirPods, I don't think it's going to be streaming lossless audio to you. Bleaker Baby saying maybe it's time to move to Wi-Fi rather than Bluetooth. I mean, that is a potential option. In fact, so Apple has AirPlay as like sort of like their Wi-Fi audio and video transmission method. And from what I understand, AirPlay is actually lossless audio. So if they switched from, you know, Bluetooth to Wi-Fi AirPlay on like their wireless devices, yeah, you'd be able to listen to lossless ostensibly. UFC fencing, wow. I'm not gonna Google that one. Yeah, Juan, I think you make an interesting point. You say that DSP, digital signal processing, seems to be a dirty word for some audiophiles, but that's where the industry is going and where a lot of research is being put into. I think you're right. I think, I'm not, honestly, personally not a big fan of DSP. I love the idea of listening to my audio in some sort of like raw, unadulterated state, but there's two truths that I think are worth recognizing. One, listening from, you know, a digital file through a DAC, you're already listening to some version of DSP, right? The DAC is taking the digital file and it's interpreting it into an analog signal that you hear. Now, ostensibly, it's going to be a neutral analog signal, but DSP isn't that different from that. You could just basically have a different rule set in your DAC that output different volume levels for different frequencies, and that would be DSP. It's not going to necessarily degrade the audio. It's just not going to be a neutral sound signature. And then the other point that I wanted to make, the other truth to talk about is just kind of looking at this the way I look at something like automatic transmissions in cars, right? I drive a manual transmission car. My first car was an automatic, but ever since then, all my cars have been manual transmissions, and I like that. I like that physical control. I love the mechanics of it. I love the activity of it. And for a long time, I loved that I could say, like, I got better gas mileage and my car was faster because it was a manual, where the automatics were almost always slower and with worse gas mileage. But I kind of knew, because automatics are controlled by computers and computers are really fast, I kind of knew that that advantage for manual transmissions was going to be a short-lived advantage. And in fact, that's where we're at now. Automatic transmissions in cars are much better, just kind of across the board, than manual transmissions. Are going to give you faster acceleration times, better gas mileage, better efficiency. They're going to be smoother. So like that sort of technical performance advantage no longer exists with manual transmissions. And I feel like DSP versus analog audio is going to go that same direction. I think digital audio is just going to overtake analog wires in the long run. That doesn't mean, though, that you have to abandon your analog stuff, because I still prefer a manual transmission. I still got a manual transmission car out in the driveway, and if I were buying a new car, I would want one that also has a manual transmission, even though it might get harder to find them in the future, there's still something about it I like, and there might still be in the future, where Bluetooth and DSP sounds unequivocally better than analog audio. There might still be, I might still prefer having wires just dangling around myself. Sounds like some weird S&M stuff, but yeah, to each their own. Quick Swip saying, I just wanted my favorite bass drivable IM. They all EQ, but so what? I mean, my favorite bassy IM is probably, I mean, I guess there's the Moondrop Dusk if you want a nice big sub bass wallop, but for under 200 bucks, actually under 150 bucks, I do think that the FH3 is a pretty good pick. And Jeremy, that's actually maybe even a better comparison. You said that DSP is analogous to image processing in phone cameras. You definitely see it becoming more popular. Yeah, I think that's another thing where, like, again, camera-wise, here, let me pull this thing out, right? This is a all-manual film camera. I actually don't know how to use this. This is a bit of a poser thing, but I do love manual lenses. I love manual photography with, you know, full-size cameras, but there's no doubt that, like, these things, these phones are they're getting pretty effective. And if my only argument, my only reason for using a larger camera is that it looks better, that is not going to be true for forever. In fact, I would make the argument that probably 90% of people out there, if you gave them, let's say, a Sony a7 III, right, or a7 IV with a nice, just beautiful lens, or you gave them an iPhone and then you set them out in their lives, the people with the iPhones are probably actually going to end up with the better pictures. For a lot of reasons. There's ease of use, but then there's also just that digital signal, that digital image processing that Apple does makes the cameras really pretty performant in a lot of places where a manual camera, like, you have to really know what you're doing. You have to make sure that your shutter speeds are sufficient for the amount of movement that's going on. You got to make sure that your subject is lit well versus the background, or you have to correct that in post-production, which you can do. But again, for 90% of people, maybe even a higher percentage of people, I think you'll actually get better pictures with an iPhone. So yeah, I think that is actually a pretty good analogy for DSP versus raw audio. Big Boss asking, does the FiO UTW adapter have IP rating? That's a good question. I actually don't know. When Kern Boys Gaming, have I ever heard about LG V60? I'm pretty sure I've heard of it, but I haven't listened to it. Samuel, have I tried the Cambridge Audio's TWS? I have not. Don't seem cricket. You're saying you wanted to thank me for getting back to you about your question regarding small profile IMs, and you wondered why I suggested the final E500. So I forget your exact comment. You probably gave me some price range that, were we talking about the 10T2 maybe? And you liked sort of that bullet style, small fitting IM. Yeah, I mean, the final E500, it's a very small fitting IM, like it's bullet style. I think maybe you were the one that mentioned having both the Moondrop SSR and the 10T2 already. So the final E500 is kind of a warmer neutral tune. It's still kind of in the realm of neutral, but I would call it, it's warmer. The upper mid-range is not as forward. It's not, I wouldn't say a bassy IM, but its bass and lower mid-range presence is a little bit thicker than it is on the SSR and the T2. So it's a little bit of a different tune. That's one of the reasons why I suggested it. And then also it fits into your price range and it fits the way that you were asking, which is very, very small. The other thing about the final E500 is just, actually, I really like it. I think it's a very nice sounding IEM for like 25 bucks, which is a really good price. In fact, I would say it's my favorite final earphone that I've heard. So I've heard the E2000 and the E1000, and I've heard the A4000, the VR3000. I think that's about it as far as like their budget line. And I think the E500, which is the cheapest, is actually my favorite sounding. Nicholas Santos Pereira saying, currently have a KZ ZS10 Pro and you'd like to upgrade. Etymotic ER2XR or the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus. Because this is live chat, I'm just going to give you an answer. The long answer is that I should really understand what you want out of an upgrade, because you know, different earphones do different things, and if you're like, I want this thing more, my answer might be different. But between the T2 Plus and the ER2XR, I'm just always going to recommend the ER2XR. I think for under 100 bucks, I can't think of anything that's I can't think of anything as good as the ER2XR. Yeah, Fixion talking about the manual transmissions. You're saying you're in the UK and manuals are the norm. Yeah, they're a lot more common there than they are here in the US. Very few people remember how to drive manuals here. But you said old automatics were slow, heavy, and clunky, and now you drive nothing but automatics. The Volkswagen DSG, it's like the dual clutch automatic is so sweet. Yeah, I've heard that. I've never actually driven one, I don't think, but I have heard that. When Kern saying BGVP NS9 is more expensive than the FH3, in your opinion, not a great value for a base EIM. I mean, look, if you just want, again, base quantities, I would say purely in base quantities, let's give this a 10 out of 10. And this, I would say, is probably maybe like a 7 out of 10. This is a pretty base EIM, but it's much more focused into the sub-bass region, and it's tasteful. If you want a tasteless amount of bass, which is kind of a rude thing to say, but some people like a lot of bass, the NS9 might satisfy you more, but not for me. Manuel Figueroa, glad you're here, even if you missed the review. It's cool, nice to see you again. All right, folks, it is about time for dinner. So I want to thank you all for tuning in, watching the review. Thank you for letting me know about the scratchy microphone. Hopefully I don't have to redo that review, but I'll review it after this, and we'll see how it goes. But thanks again for the conversation. Thank you for hitting the like button, because I can tell you hit the like button. If you didn't already, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel, but you're here right now, you've already subscribed to the channel, and I will see you on the next super review. Have a good week.